In its infancy, sampling was often viewed as a lazier, less creative method of producing songs. Though it's more widely accepted now, the general views of music sampling are still pretty nuanced. Defined by a necessity for originality, it's hard to legally define the line between borrowing elements of older songs or straight up copying. That being said, samples are entirely distinct from copies. As defined by the Abbey Road Institute, sampling is when you include an element of a pre-existing recording by someone else in your composition. The sample can be anything that you've sampled from, another track, a rhythm, a melody, a beat, vocals or speech, which you then manipulate, edit, chop up, or loop to fit creatively within your work. Originality in music is often described as a musical display of the personality of the author, evidence of skill, and overall legitimate and intellectual effort. But that being said, why shouldn't samples be considered fair use? From a more social and cultural perspective, genres as a whole are defined by the rich stories of those who have crafted them in the past. Much like a tapestry, there are interwoven histories between these songs, meshing of cultures, of soundscapes, and overall forgotten stories that can be traced back to new listeners. The tapestry-like nature of samples and songs they've stemmed from is seen throughout much of modern music, but one notable example can be found in one of the most famous hip-hop rappers of all time, MF Doom. In his critically acclaimed song, Rap Snitches Knishes, Doom incorporated fragments of songs that surpass his fame entirely, but most people who listen would never even notice without searching deeper.
Yo, MF Doom,
Mr.
Fantastic.
Villain.
What up, nigga?
Ain't nothing, what's the word?
It's cracking, boy.
Same old shit, kid.
Man,
Day, you
rap
know?
snitches, man. Shit is bugged out, man. What the fuck, man?
You telling me?
Niggas running their mouth, telling everything.
Critical.
But to best understand the chronological progression of this iconic rap song, we have to turn to an even more iconic song, Space Oddity.
Ground control to Major Tom.
Space Oddity is a glamorous rock song, written and performed by a glamorous rocker, David Bowie. He sings about a fictional astronaut named Major Tom, who's losing connection with ground control and spiraling away. If you were to say these two songs are nothing alike, you'd be entirely right. The next derivative work in this musical oncology is actually a cover of Space Oddity, performed by jazz pianist David Williams for his album entitled Dune, which ironically is also taking inspiration from a different sci-fi entity. Covers are also entirely distinct from copies as well. Though they are reimaginings of previous songs, much of the meat comes from the original author, whereas music samples are more so dissected pieces of songs used in an entirely different context. Listening to a cover is a lot like reading a book in a different font from the original, whereas samples are more like allusions to an entirely different book altogether. The part in question from David Matthews' retelling of Space Oddity is actually not in the original at all. In the middle of the song, David Matthews uniquely added a bridge with a totally different guitar riff that you may actually recognize. The progression of these three songs are confusing to say the least, but they are entirely distinct from one another. MF Doom's song is completely transformative from both of its predecessors. Beyond a genre shift, the whole story and lyrics are entirely different, showing that the sample is part of an ensemble of a craft, not the heart of the song. This leads to my second point. Original authors don't lose money from creators sampling their music. They're usually in entirely different genres, so they're really not competitive, and no one would listen to one song as opposed to another. MF Doom's Rap Snitches Knishes will never be more famous than David Bowie's Space Odyssey, but in a similar vein, neither will David Matthews' cover. In this way, none of these three songs take away from the others, but find a way to live on in a new context.
Okay. And they weren't sampling these records because they were too lazy to write their own music. They weren't sampling these records to cash in on the familiarity of the original stuff. To be honest, it was all about sampling really obscure things. But the thing is, they were sampling those records because they heard something in that music that spoke to them, that they instantly wanted to inject themselves into the narrative of that music. They heard it, they wanted to be a part of it, and all of a sudden they found themselves in possession of the technology to do so.
MF Doom's song was not made to steal from David Bowie's or David Matthews' fans. In fact, only with a keen ear could one really notice the murky connection between these songs. Yes, Rap Snitches Knishes could have been made without the guitar verse, but who's to say this legendary snippet from David Williams' cover should only have been used once throughout all of time. In NPR's The Formula, a series all about the magic of sampling in modern music, it's clear that Just Blaze has the utmost respect for these classic songs. When he plays the 1973 song Shaft in Africa, he's not stealing, but honoring this amazing song from history and amplifying it in a modern lens. This idea of honoring, not stealing from past works, leads to my final point. Modern users use samples like a platform to introduce forgotten songs to a new audience. Aging musical works and ideas can live on with these recontextualizations, and those who fall in love with these newer songs often find themselves doing their own research and ultimately rediscovering these older gems. Modern music as a rebirth of older classics is found throughout much of today's social consciousness, oftentimes in songs you aren't even aware of. Labi Siffre, a legendary singer, songwriter, and poet, is one of the most famous musicians you've likely never heard of. Though he released and performed dozens of songs throughout the 70s, 80s, and even up until today, he never reached the fame that he and his talent should have reached because he was a gay black musician in the wrong time period. Though his music never reached the appeal it likely should have, a number of his songs have been reincorporated into many famous hits now. Kanye West, an artist who's widely known to have built a career in sampling and rapping, most famously used a sample of Labi Siffre in his famous hit, I Wonder.
I've been waiting on this my whole life.
Ironically, the original song he used from is Labi Siffre's My Song.
This is my song, and no one.
Another example of Labi Siffre's songs living on in the public consciousness can even be found in works from Eminem. In My Name Is, one of the songs that helped jumpstart his career, Eminem subversively used bars directly from Labi Siffre's I've Gotta. The example of Eminem's borrowing of Labi Siffre's music is a bit more problematic, however. Though the song is entirely transformative, it unfortunately is an example of a white author gaining fame where a black author could not. In a Marketplace article about the exploitation of black authors in music, Jasmine Guards writes, "The industry has been accused of exploiting musicians of all backgrounds, but Temple University law professor Funmi Arewa said labels especially profited off black musicians who were already in vulnerable positions. The whole idea of copyright is that we are supposed to reward creativity," Arewa said. And what we see systematically is business structures and the use of copyright in ways that deprive African Americans of benefits that should have been flowed to them. The difference between Eminem's song, however, is that Siffre actually did give him permission to use his song. In actuality, Siffre made a change to Eminem's original work, insisting that a slightly insensitive bar about his gym teacher being gay be taken out entirely. When going on Spotify, it is actually possible to find writing credits for Labi Siffre for the song, but unfortunately, you have to comb through a few menus first. Overall, regardless of the intention behind the sample in a song, it is so important to get permission from the original author to augment their work. Even if your work is entirely transformative and non-exploitative, the last way you'd want to honor a legendary song from history would be to defile the author who made it. I think that it's pretty evident that samples, if used correctly, should be in fair use. Music as a whole is all about creativity and expression, and by continuing this ongoing tapestry of artist to artist, we can effectively honor and build from those who have come before us.